I'm a new faculty member at San Francisco State. I was hired in 2017 in Women and Gender Studies with a specialization in trans feminisms. And as I considered the question today about thinking about who we're accountable to, I started thinking about what we're talking about when we talk about accountability. And so to kind of, I hope you'll give me the space to kind of muse a little bit on what we mean when we say accountability. And to frame the discussion, I want to tell you a little bit about a class session that I was teaching. I'm teaching a class on social movements right now. And we're having a conversation about anti-violence and self-defense movements. And we were discussing community accountability. So this is one of the kind of frameworks that Clarissa was sharing with us earlier. And as we were talking, I got to talk about all the amazing work that many have done to think about addressing and preventing harm in the space of and in the context of a sort of non-institutionalized response, and what that means, and how groups like Incite, Women of Color Against Violence, Communities Against Rape and Abuse in Seattle, Creative Interventions, and many others have elaborated a lot of these ideas, and Clarissa has of course been instrumental in many of this. And so one of the things that this framework really does is to center harm and to think about redress and imagine the possibility of repair, or its impossibility, and what to do that's for. And so this really ended up resonating with my students, as I'm sure folks aren't surprised, many of whom have encountered violence and many other expressions of subordination. So I really enjoyed bringing this to class, in part because I lived in Seattle in the early 2000s, and so the development and elaboration of these frameworks was part of my organizing education. And having the opportunity to learn from the people who are developing these frameworks really got me to think a lot about what we mean when we say accountability. But I realized as I talked with my class that I really don't use the term very much anymore, and I got curious about why. And my sense is that I've encountered it in a different register recently. I'm a new faculty member, so these debates are very sort of in my sight zone right now about debates about institutionalization and accountability in higher education. They're incredibly important debates, and I'm interested in them. But I'm noticing that they're ending up being debates about who or what we must answer to, which ends up being a story about responsibility. So I'm going to risk over-summarizing wildly here, and I'm getting this a lot, but this ends up being a story about tension between different forms of accountability. The first form being the kind of metrical form, which is, of course, the statistical arsenal of neoliberalizing higher education that many of us are much more familiar with than we'd like to be. And then, in potential direct tension with this, at least that's the way that the story goes, is a political accountability to, say, feminist activisms, trans feminisms, many other forms of leftist and progressive activism, and of course radicalism. And ethnic studies has, of course, laid so much of the framework for this, and this is ethnic studies and its elaborations have been part of the grounds through which our department at San Francisco State has been able to exist as an institution. So this idea then of split allegiances or competing forms of accountability end up kind of telling the story. But in both senses, accountability ends up being about responsibility. And one sort of answers to targets and outputs and measures, and the other to positions fashioned through grassroots political formations. And so it ends up being a story about bad institutional metrics and good grassroots community politics, which I suggest might not be the most generative starting point, not the least of which is because, you know, as we know, movements and institutions are complex beasts, though one of those is, of course, probably much more complex and beastly than the other, but nevertheless, it gives us a moment to sort of reflect on how we're setting up the sort of good character, bad character dichotomy in a way that lets us sidestep or enables a sidestepping of some of the questions that I would argue are the most important. So in these conversations with my class, I went back to this framing of community accountability and its emphasis on harm and redress, and thought a lot about how these are about not only being responsible or answerable to people or to movements or even to measures, but about what caused harm in the first place and what might be the persistent consequences of such harm. And insights framing, too, is about collective action to confront the dynamics of subjugation that produce relations of violence, right? And so I would argue, too, if we kind of move away from this good politics versus bad statistics dichotomy, that we're probably much more likely to get somewhere with that question of how these conditions are actually continuing to produce these relations if we emphasize these questions of harm or redress. And of course, as we do so, I want to kind of recognize other folks who have presented before me and say, that doesn't mean that they're fixed. An apology is not enough, right? And so what is it that enables a different kind of conversation without pretending that a sorry is sufficient? So to revisit the question then, I'm just curious. I mean, this isn't an answer, it's more questions, but I'm asking how an emphasis or a shift to questions of harm or redress, in addition to questions of accountability and responsibility, might redirect our attention or care and enable a different entry point for our questions about what we're answering to or to whom we're answering. And so this is part of what I'm hoping to discuss more today. And of course, community accountability is specifically about intimate partner violence. That was the sort of frame within which it was elaborated. And that's, of course, very different from questions of institutionalized accountability. Yet, as we're hearing on the prior panel, these are, of course, wildly interconnected and intertwined. And I think it's really worth thinking about what we can learn from community accountability models and from organizing models in general. I mean, these are the sites from which we came, but I think that we can do a lot more answering to our knowledge production, as Rana was saying before. Practical problems are knowledge problems, and the practical problems that brought us here are the knowledge problems that we can elaborate with the community and organizing models from which we came. So hopefully these can give us some cues, and I look forward to figuring out how and asking different kinds of questions and figuring out what kinds of questions we can start asking given that shift. So I'd like to really thank my co-panelists and look forward to pursuing this in discussion.